As you can see by the massive screen behind me, this is Beg, Borrow, and Steal. We're going to talk about what we can learn about other content admin from other CMSs. So the first question you're all probably asking is, who's this guy? My name's Andy Brown. I've been doing HTML since I found my dad's Learn HTML in 24 Hours book back in '96. Finished that book in 22 hours, not to brag. So I'm kind of a big deal. And then I went to school for communication. I got 3/4 of the way through my education when I realized I was about to graduate with a degree in communication. Wasn't quite sure what to do with that. So then I got, what at the time UNH was a minor in computer science, even though I didn't call it that. So I took a bunch of computer science classes, realized I really liked it, got out of college and decided, like everybody does, to try to create their own content management system. And got not very far into that before I realized there was a whole bunch of other smarter people who had already done it. So that's how I landed on Drupal. I've been doing that since '07, which I realized when I was putting this together is a really long time ago now. It makes me feel old, but that's okay. So I've been doing that for a while. I currently work at Pegasystems in Cambridge. It's walkable. I walked here this morning. And I am from New Hampshire, which will just explain a lot about me, so I'll just put it up there. I've also read a book recently. It's called Learn Conference Presenting in 24 Hours. And hour one, for some reason, was don't forget a picture of yourself in your intro slide. So that's me. And just to get the questions out the way, yes, that's real. Yes, I do own a Christmas onesie. Yes, I've worn it in public. No, you can't have it. And yes, it's very hot. But more importantly than who I am, it's why should you listen to me? I'm a Drupal developer. I'm a back-end guy. This is a conference for UI, UX, and designers, and I'm none of those things. I don't know UI very well. I don't really do UX, but I do have some unique insights. This is Mama Brown, the one up there, and that's the golden child. That's me. So my parents, born and raised in England, came over here 40 some odd years ago. My dad's a computer engineer, but Mom went to school to be a teacher, so she was a biology teacher for high school back in England. Came over here and raised 4 kind of beautiful children. And then worked at and then bought and owns Montessori preschool. And the reason I'm telling you this is that she was not of the technology generation, the way we know it. And she never really had a job that required any sort of technology. But regardless of that, she actually really loves technology when it works right. When it works the way she expects it to, she loves it. She's always had the first iPhone in the family and all that sort of stuff. But she gets really easily angered when it doesn't work right. So when the golden child would come home from college for a visit, instead of being met with a warm welcome, I'd walk in and she would be in the office swearing at the printer because it wasn't printing. So I'd walk in, being the golden child that I am, and I would, troubleshoot it. I'd walk over to the printer, hit the on button, it would start printing, and she would thank me by yelling at me because the printer has an on button. And why does the effing printer have an on button? I can't answer that question because I didn't design the printer. I didn't make the printer. I didn't sell her the printer. I just knew that you hit the on button and it prints. She had a good point, but growing up with that, I kind of brought that with me into development, especially when it comes to making or adding content to websites. So I created what I call the mom rule. And the idea is that content entry should be easy enough that it won't make my mom yell at me for creating a website for her. So at some point I did actually have the chance to make her website for her Montessori school. And I actually built it on Drupal 7. And it was a success, which is probably a surprise to some people. The reason it was a success was because I used structured content for a lot of it. And we'll get into kind of what that means. But she did actually want a blog on the site, and I just flat out told her no, because I knew that at the time, trying to give her a way to add something that was more than just filling out a form to create a page was gonna make her angry, and I don't need to come home to that. So the structured content was the key to success. She fills out the form, content shows up as she expects, everything's great. So that's kind of like the good old days of the web in terms of like content entry, but things have changed. And in my notes here I have a pause for uncomfortable murmurs because I understand that this is a bold claim and also a bit of a hypocrisy considering I'm doing this presentation on a Mac. But hear me out. When we were first doing the internet, even back in 2007 when I'm making my first Drupal sites, the web was mainly desktop based. We were talking about 600 by 800 pixel screens, and that's kind of all you really had to worry about when you're doing the design of things. And so that kind of carried over to the content admin side of things as well. But now that once Steve Jobs here created basically the mobile web, not as such, but he was kind of the one that brought it into the mainstream. We now have this like plethora of sizes and shapes and ways of accessing our websites now. So we had this kind of idea of a mobile web, which is now morphed into a more responsive web. Again, I'm not a designer or anything like that, so I'm not going to get into the details of grid layouts and CSS and JavaScript. But I want to talk about how this transition to that sort of layout has kind of changed the way that we have to think about content admin as well. So the difference now is kind of that structured content that I was talking about before as opposed to more of a modular content. So what I mean by that is, it's a good example of structured content. We have our form that we fill out with just fields and whatever. And it's kind of like a Mad Libs. So I don't know if anybody remembers Mad Libs or if they're even still a thing. I think they're probably still a thing. Basically fill it all out and it just plugs things where they need to go and everything's great. And so this works really well for like repeatable content, things like calendar, events, that sort of stuff. They're kind of going to have the same information all the time. They're going to look basically the same all the time, or even like a bio for somebody. There's not going to be that much different. But when we're talking about new types of content now, we're talking about modular content, things like home pages on your website, or landing pages, or even like blogs, those sorts of things, where you kind of want to give the person who's creating the content a bit more of a choice than this is how it has to look every time. It's going to look the same every time. You want to give them a little bit of flexibility. So now we're talking about smaller pieces or components that they can then mix and match and create these rows or layers of content. So again, now we have different components that have different pieces to them, and they can just get dropped in and rearranged and added to a page. And so the Drupal solution to that was originally, back in the day, it was just a WYSIWYG, CK editor or something along those lines. And when I first started doing Drupal sites, we would talk about this to clients. It's easy. It's just as easy as creating an email or writing a Word document because it looks the interface looked very similar. And it had its pros and cons. It was easy for the user to understand. They'd seen that interface before and they knew how it worked. And they could be pretty flexible with what they were doing with it, but it wasn't responsive at all, unless you did some real hacky things that make me feel dirty just thinking about. And then we kind of dabbled a bit with blocks everywhere, trying to make those responsive, and beans and all of that. But that quickly got taken over by paragraphs, which is kind of where we are now. Paragraphs are great because they would give us these repeatable blocks that we could then rearrange and create as many as we wanted to and put all these rules behind. And it worked for a while. But even at Pega now, we're running into issues where there's almost too many paragraphs on a page. So we have just the different amounts of options that we're giving people and what they can build, we have nested paragraphs inside nested paragraphs inside nested paragraphs. And we're talking, sometimes they've built pages that are so big that it takes 30 seconds to a minute to every time you click save the page, just because there's so much going on behind the scenes. So Drupal still kind of has this reputation of being hard to use. So what can we borrow from other content management systems? So I'm going to touch on a couple today. Obviously the first is going to be WordPress because it runs a third of the internet, I think, at this point, or a third of content management. I think it's a third of the internet. So you kind of have to talk about the giant in the room. And then we'll also talk about Squarespace and AEM, or Adobe Experience Manager, which are kind of the opposite ends of the spectrum. But we'll get to those in a bit. We'll start with WordPress. WordPress just introduced 5.0, and they introduced it with this new editing interface that they call Gutenberg. It's apparently been in the works for 4 years now or so. It was created by Automatic, which is kind of the Acquia of WordPress. They're a company that runs WordPress and develops it, and is owned by the guy who invented WordPress. So they do a lot of like this sort of stuff. If anybody's ever written an article on Medium, I don't know if anybody has. No, a lot of blanks. Okay, so it's kind of similar to that, where it's very focused on kind of getting out of the way and just being able to focus on creating the content. So this is literally it. This is one of the websites I created for my brother. He decided he wanted to be a sports writer. I knew that wouldn't last, so I just created a WordPress site for him because it was easy. And I was right. But it's still up, and this is what it looks like. So there's, like when you create a new page, it just gives you this, and you can just start typing. You start typing, it'll add the title. You hit enter, it'll put you in the body, and you start typing, writing body text. Every time you hit enter, it creates a new row that defaults to text, and then you can add other stuff. So this is what adding other stuff looks like. So you can see I've added some text in the background there. I hit enter, and it just creates a new row for me underneath. And then there's this plus button down here. It's tough to see. But that opens up this kind of modal that gives you all these different things that you can plug in otherwise. So you can see there's a couple of basic ones here, quotes and galleries and lists and stuff. And they've made it really easy. The other part about this that's really interesting is they have automatic embedding. So if you were to copy and paste a YouTube link, for instance, and just drop it into this bottom spot, like the next slot down, it will automatically convert that into an embedded YouTube video with that URL. Same with like Twitter links or Reddit links or anything like that. It'll just automatically convert those. So it's kind of really easy to get up and running. Like I said before, the main focus really is the content. So if you look here, this is me editing the text, and it just gives you this little bar at the top that just has basic generic text editing features. So it's not like a full WYSIWYG, but just kind of like the generics. And then if there's anything else over here, it'll give you the config for that section. So we can change the color of the background and the text if you wanted to in that color drop down. You can see I've checked the drop cap one, so it's done this, and it does it kind of live as you're going. So it's pretty slick. So if we're going back to my mom's Montessori school website, this would actually be really good for creating a blog for her. This is something she could use if her site was on WordPress, but I'm not going to redo her site on WordPress. So are there any alternatives in Drupal? Turns out there is. Seriously, this Gutenberg editor was kind of a standalone piece. And so some Drupal developers have actually taken it and brought it into Drupal. So it's a Drupal module, project/Gutenberg, and it's under like really active development right now. The 1.0 release, stable release, just happened, I think, last week before, something like that. So it's kind of it's in active development. Good thing about this is you can enable it on a content type level. So basically, just install the module, go into content type and just say, yes, use the Gutenberg editor interface, and it works. In fact, I've actually put it on another one of my sites, and this is what it looks like. So it looks basically the same. We've got the same kind of content over here, config over here, and then it's just Drupal at the top instead of WordPress down the side. And it works the same way. But it does have kind of pros and cons. The pros, obviously, it passes the mom rule. She's not going to yell at me if I have her use this. My brother, not all that technically advanced in this sort of stuff. I had him initially writing his blog posts on a Drupal site using paragraphs, and he could do it, and it worked well enough. But then I set up the WordPress site, and he was away, and it was like night and day for him. It's really easy to add content. It's really easy to set up, and the embedded content stuff just kind of works. You drop a link in there, and it just converts it for you automatically, which is cool. Again, it's really good for blogs and that sort of thing. And moving content is actually really easy, which I'll touch on in a bit. But even like between WordPress and Drupal, you can just kind of copy the whole content from one, drop it in another, and it just shows up, and it looks the same in both spots. Some things to kind of keep in mind, though, is it's very opinionated. It comes pre-styled out of the box, and it can be kind of hard to override. So for the drop cap thing that I showed you before, that will actually wrap that first letter in a tag with some styles. All the styles, even in the Drupal version of the module, start with WP dash. So they're all kind of still WordPressy things. And so things like adding tables to this will still have like WordPress classes in the table that you then have to kind of either undo or remove or anything like that. So it can be kind of an all or nothing sort of thing. It doesn't really integrate particularly well if you've already got like a design set up or something like that. So it would take a bunch of extra work to kind of undo what they've done and do it in your own way. It also says everything is kind of one blob of content with some little snippets of code in between each thing to kind of tell the Gutenberg editor what each piece is, which is great for when we're moving content around because you can literally just kind of drag everything over and then drop it in another spot. But we're kind of dealing with masses of content, so if we wanted to change one thing across a bunch of blogs, we'd have to kind of go into each one and change them because they're not kind of listening to each other or it's not so much of a componentized idea. So if that's not a big deal, especially for things like blogs, it doesn't tend to come up where you need to change one piece across a bunch of blogs because they're kind of one-off pieces. That's not that big a deal, but if you're using it for something else, you might have to kind of just keep that in mind. And if you're trying to add new pieces to that pop-up box, say you want to add a new piece of functionality for something, it's all built in React, so React is kind of something else you're going to need to learn. As a Drupal developer, that's not something I've got to yet, and I know we all have a ton of time to just learn whatever we want, so I'm sure it's not a problem, but I put it in the cons anyway. And also, I don't know if any of you noticed, but the config, especially on the Drupal side of things, looks like that. It's not great. So actually, it's recommended if you're creating a content type with this is to literally just have a body field and nothing else, because any other fields that you have to deal with will get crammed in this tiny little sidebar there, and they don't look great. So this works for me because it's my website and I don't really care, and I know how it works and I can get around it, but I'm not going to give this to my mom because she's going to yell at me. So that's Gutenberg. Something to keep in mind. Now we're going to touch on the other two, AEM and Squarespace, and I'm going to kind of do them together, and I'll tell you why in a sec. But just to kind of give you an idea of what they are, AEM is an enterprise solution that competes with a lot of Drupal sites. I know that in some of the agencies I worked in before, we looked into figuring out how to do AEM developers so we can offer that along with some of the other big ones like Sitecore or like an Acquia Drupal sort of thing, because it's this massive, you get everything all at once. Adobe's kind of known for that, so you get the whole suite of Adobe products, and this is part of it, and you get like all the like the digital asset management included, and like all of the personalization stuff that you can do A/B testing, all this. It's this big, massive package, which I believe the average license is, they don't really tell you how much it costs, because if you have to ask, you can't afford it, sort of thing. But I found this off your blog post, and the average license is probably in the $500,000 range, and if you're doing a project on this, it's going to cost you like $2 million out the gate. So that's kind of the behemoth on one end of the scale. And the other end of the scale is Squarespace, which if you've ever listened to any podcast ever, you know what Squarespace is, because it's everywhere. And it's basically aimed at the exact opposite. It's aimed at people who don't have a lot of technical know-how. They're not coders. Their whole thing is you can build a site without knowing how to code. It's aimed at small businesses, and it usually starts at $12 a month. And they handle everything for you. They handle your domains and your email and SEO and all that stuff. It's kind of built in. The reason I'm talking about them together is because the interface is actually really similar, the way they work. I'm going to show Squarespace here because AM doesn't do free demos for people who title their talks Beg, Borrow, and Steal. What are you going to do? But I did have, I've got a friend who does AM development, so he kind of just walked me through what they look like, and it's actually surprisingly similar to this. So we're just going to talk about Squarespace. So this, you can set up a site for free, and so I did that, and this is my design for Drupal site. And it looks kind of familiar to the Gutenberg editor. It has the same, if you want to add a block, it has the same sort of idea behind it. The one thing different about this is you can kind of click and drag anything you want kind of wherever you want. So if you want the image that's in the bottom right to be in the top left, just kind of click it and drag it, and it resorts everything and figures it out. Unlike the Gutenberg experience, this is almost identical, like what you see is what you get. You click save and that's your page. Then you can click edit and you can edit different pieces, and you click save and it just kind of shows that to you, and that's what everybody else is going to see. So in that way it's kind of a better representation of what you're editing and how it's actually going to look in the end. It kind of has that similar feel of the Inline WYSIWYG. So you see if I click on the text here, you get this a bit more in-depth text WYSIWYG sort of thing compared to the Gutenberg one, or even the stuff we have in Drupal. And if I were to click down here and it's like this text, it would disappear the top one and move it down there, and it would it's very contextual as to what it's doing, and it'll change depending on what you're actually clicking on. And then the last piece that they have here that I thought was really cool was this Inplace image editing. So kind of have that in some of the other ones, but this is a lot more polished. You click on an image and this box shows up, and you can replace the image or do things like that. But you can also even do things like design and animation, so you can make it fade in and fade out, or you can put a black and white filter on it like that, all right here. And then you click save and it just kind of updates, and it immediately shows you what we're looking at. So this is pretty cool. Do we have any alternatives in Drupal like we did for WordPress? No. That would have been pretty cool though, wouldn't it? But we do have something, and at this point it's probably not much of a surprise. But we have layoutbuilder, the chosen one. Oh man. That picture looks better on my screen. A whole lot of pixels in that. All right, that's okay. So layoutbuilder, great, problem solved. We're all done. We can go home. Not quite. I mean, you've probably seen a bunch of walkthroughs of it yesterday, because it's the new hotness. So I'm not going to show you the umami demo or the teaser video or anything like that. But I do want to just kind of touch on it and kind of give some things that I've learned about it, some pros and cons, some helpful hints, that sort of stuff. So for those that haven't stumbled across this so far, Layout Builder, it's built in Drupal core, just got released in the latest release. I think that happened at DrupalCon recently. The last one was kind of about the time it got announced and released, and it was stable. But it is still a new ecosystem. We don't have the really 4 years of build-up compared to like the Gutenberg editor or anything like that, because we haven't got there yet. So some of the pros and cons, it's super flexible in a couple different ways. The first one is that we can add all our different blocks, all our different pieces of our Drupal site, all our entities, into this layout builder. And it does things kind of the Drupal way, whereas the Gutenberg editor kind of just took over everything and forced its design and its way onto our site. This we can kind of fit in better. It'll fit into our theme that we've already got set up and things like that. And it can be used on a global or individual level. And by that I mean we can set it up so that it is being used to control a layout of every node across a content type or individual nodes like on the fly. We do have some less than positive things, I guess. It doesn't pass the mom rule yet, and I'll show you that in a little bit. For me, and this has taken me a while to get my head around, and I understand why, but it's still a bit of a caveat, is that the content and the layout are still kind of weirdly separate at times. So I think that's kind of something we have to work towards. And then it is still a little rough around the edges. Even just kind of setting this up for the demo, it is a white screened a few times, just installing modules and things like that. So there's still, again, because it's still young, we have some things to keep in mind. The other thing I want to touch on is that this is nice because we can still provide both the structured and the unstructured type of content interfaces. So we don't have to, this works similar to Gutenberg, we can turn it on for just certain content types. So we can have a landing page content type that we can use Layout Builder for, but I can still have my calendar event content type that doesn't get touched by this, and it's still the exact same way. We're just filling out a form, and it makes it the way that we always expect it to do. So just like when a lot of other things in Drupal were new, I'm thinking back to Drupal 7. When you install Drupal 7, there was all these like modules that made things a little bit easier, a little bit better, that you kind of would install with every site without really thinking about. Things like, CTools and WYSIWYG and all that stuff. You just kind of just like did it to make things start off on a better footing. So these are the two I'm going to touch on now. There's actually a page on drupal.org that kind of has a bunch of additional modules. So I went through and tried them out. And these are the two that kind of stuck out to me in terms of like usefulness and kind of getting us off on the right foot. The first one is Layout Builder restrictions. And what it does is, by default, when you turn on Layout Builder, it gives Layout Builder access to every single block in the system, like every block. All the Powered by Drupal block is available to be added to Layout Builder. And this kind of gives us a way to filter the different ones that we want to use, and I'll show that in a bit. And the other one is Layout Builder modal. And so initially if you just install Layout Builder by itself and you want to create something as you're going, it pops up this little sidebar here, which I'll show you in a sec, and that's where all the kind of content management happens. So this module just kind of pulls that out, makes it easier to see, makes it easier to use, kind of looks like this. So, like I said before, well, actually I could go through screenshots and that'd be great, and you'd all fall asleep. But I think I'm going to do something a little bit different. We're going to see how this goes because I'm going to have to turn around to do it. But from my Learn conference presenting in 24 hours book, hour 2, was under no circumstances do you do a live demo. So we're going to do a live demo. Let's see how we're going to do this. Because you can see that, but I can't. All right. Oh, I do have a mouse. There we go. All right, so I just created a basic Drupal site. Pretty straightforward. I've created a couple content types in here. As you can see, I got my Gutenberg page and my layout builder page. So let's start with the Gutenberg page real quick. And the only thing I did was install the module, and then came in here and said, yeah, enable the Gutenberg experience. There's some config that come with it, just kind of what blocks you want to allow in the pop-up that shows up, which is kind of nice of them. You can even allow Drupal blocks if you want, but I don't have any on here that are really worth looking at. I'll turn the search form on, the image block that I created earlier. And that's kind of it. All I have for fields is just a body field, and that's it, because it needs a body field to attach itself to, but when you create a content type, that kind of comes by default anyway, so that's great. So what does that look like? So I've created a page here, and if we edit it, it's WordPress. Well, it's not. But it's the Gutenberg. So we have our config over here, and you can see it's relatively simple. So if we don't really want to have a whole bunch of crazy config on this side, because we've seen what it looks like before. But we can literally just add blocks in here. In fact, if you just start typing, it'll just keep saving. If I hit enter, I now have a new row. So we can move these up and down if you want. But this is where we can add different blocks. So we have embeds, we have Drupal blocks if we want. And so it's all pretty straightforward. My mom would not yell at me if I had her use this. Pretty straightforward. Well, it does do this every time you save and or leave the page though. A little awkward. So I've also created a very similar page, but this one's using Layout Builder. And if I edit this, this is all you see. So this is what I was talking about when I was talking about the separation of content and layout. And I think I understand why they did it, because sometimes you're going to want to control the layout of every single page of a certain content type that you don't want to give the users access to, so that you can still have where you have them still filling out the forms, and then Layout Builder handles how things show up. But the other way of doing it is to not have any fields and do all your content entry in the Layout tab. So there's been a whole bunch of talks about this. I think there's actually another one going on right now about Layout Builder. But this is kind of the interface for it. It's nice. It's not as polished as maybe like a Squarespace or an AAM. There's no kind of real there's kind of drag and drop functionality, but it's a little awkward. Like, okay. But the basic idea is you can add sections, which is kind of like adding a new row in the Gutenberg experience. And that pops up this side, where you can choose your layout, which is one column. And then in that section, we can now add blocks. We add a block, slides out again. And if we didn't have the, let's create an image block. If we didn't have the image modal, or the layout modal module installed, it would try to do everything in this little sidebar here. But because we have that installed, it pops it up like this. Makes things a little easier. Integrates with media and media library and things like that, so it's very Drupal-centric. If you're familiar with Drupal, you'll kind of pick this up pretty quickly. I think even my mom, she's had some Drupal experience, even with Drupal 7, she could probably figure this out, but I guarantee this would anger her, just looking at this. So I think if I was to give this to her, what I would do is I would, at the very least, change the name of the tabs so that my edit tab is now the layout tab for her. And the edit tab is more like config, something like that, because this would be a good spot to put metadata and things like that. Things that don't really have to do with the content of the page, but are still necessary for like more complex configuration stuff that you need to do that you wouldn't necessarily want to put in something like a Gutenberg page. And so, let's see what else I can show. Oh yeah, so to set this up, pretty straightforward. It's this one here. So this is my display. If you look at my content type, it just has this field which is created automatically when you check the Use Layout Builder box. And this is the other module I was telling you about, where we can filter the different types of blocks that show up. So we can either say all of them or choose some of them if we wanted. And we can also create some custom blocks too that we can drop in there, which is what you saw before. So that is both of the two different types of things. So it's not that I think one is better than the other or anything like that, but I think we can kind of pick and choose how we want to use both of those depending on the situation. So let's see if I can go back to this. All right, so to recap, Gutenberg, it's straight from WordPress, so blogging is kind of in its design by default. So it's great for blog content, it's great for easily just kind of jumping in, turning it on, and handing it off. Easy to set up, easy to use, really good with embedded content. Some of the things to keep in mind, though, is it's really opinionated with styling and things like that, so you may have to undo some of that sort of stuff. The content is a blob, so kind of moving stuff around is going to be easy, and copying and pasting, you can just kind of copy an entire blog post if you want, drop in a new one. But changing specific things across a bunch of different ones might be a little bit more difficult. And if you are going to want to extend it, something other than just a simple Drupal block, you're going to have to learn how to do React, which I'm sure is on everybody else's list as well after this week. But it's just something else to keep in mind. As opposed to Layout Builder, which is good for landing page content. Things like a home page that may have a bit more functionality, a bit more kind of Drupalisms than a blog. And it does things the Drupal way, so it's a bit more future-proof in that way. So as Drupal keeps going, as we kind of keep building this out, it's going to kind of integrate more and more into the way Drupal builds websites. So we're not going to have to worry about down the road, like we have some Gutenberg stuff, and maybe there's something that doesn't quite coincide with how we built the site. And again, it's really flexible, not just from like what we can add to the layout builder, but also kind of how we use it. So we can use it on individual nodes, or we can use it across a whole site technically, but across a whole content type or multiple content types. Things to keep in mind, it's not quite finished yet. Doesn't feel polished as something I would give to Mama Brown yet, because she is surprisingly scary, even though she's little and British. And there is kind of a more complex setup. Instead of just kind of turning it on and you're good to go, there's a bunch of work you kind of have to do. You have to create the blocks you want to be able to give people and things like that. So yeah, it's not quite mom friendly yet. So that's what I've got for you guys today. I don't know if we have any questions or if you wanted me to show you anything that I didn't touch on in the demo, but that's what I got. Yeah.
With Layout Builder, are you able to move fields on the node into these sections, or is it always moving blocks?
No, so you can move fields into it.
Repeat the question.
Oh yes. So the question was, can you just move around blocks in Layout Builder, or can you do fields as well? And you can do fields as well, and that's actually how the demo site, or the Umami demo for Layout Builder works. Because that's how you can control multiple nodes in a content type with the same layout. So it does when you create, if you have fields in the content type and you turn on layout builder, it will put those in there and then you can move them around. So you can do it that way. I've just found that it's almost like an extra step too far. But if you already have a fielded content type, you can turn layout builder on and it'll move everything into that. But for that sort of thing, I would do kind of a global layout that you've built for that content type. Then you can change it on the global change, and it'll populate through all those content types. Sure. Yeah.
Are there certain types of development teams that are better served using Drupal versus WordPress or some other CMS, depending on the industry?
Are there any industry-specific reasons to use Drupal versus WordPress?
Yeah, as far as like the types of pages that they would be building based on the project.
I mean, I think WordPress excels specifically well at blog content. It's kind of where it started. That's what it's mainly built for, but the community has come and built up around that to extend it into other things. I think there's a BuddyPress not module, what do they call them? Extensions? What is it? Plugin, that's right. So they've created ones that you can do like social networks and things like that. So, but there's a lot of things around it, but at its core, it's very good at blogging. I haven't done any massive WordPress sites in a long time, so my information is probably a bit outdated, but I think for kind of user management and things like that, if you need a lot of roles and permissions and that sort of stuff, that's Drupal's focus. So if you have a bunch of different types of users that are going to be using the website, I would definitely go with Drupal as opposed to WordPress. But it's going to be kind of a more straightforward, just a couple of people editing the website and they know what they're doing, and you want to give them the keys to the castle, WordPress is fine too.
Yeah, probably like I was thinking like with the Drupal and all. I mostly, to be honest, primarily use WordPress. I'm learning a lot about Drupal today. But probably like e-commerce sites, I would think, where you have like so many different specific pieces of information and content. Probably Drupal probably serves that much better than WordPress.
Yeah, WordPress is very, Drupal is very good at setting up kind of views of content and aggregations of content too, because that's all built in with views. And you're able to kind of collate, I guess. I'm not sure that's the right word, but have the different sort of like workflows that will then automatically populate different lists and different views of the types of content as well. Yeah. So, and this layout builder is just kind of yet another way of getting the content into the system, which is kind of the biggest pain point, I think, right now, just for content management systems in general, just because of the changes we've gone through at this point.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
If there was one feature that you had to steal from Gutenberg or one feature from both Gutenberg or Squarespace, what would it be to add to layout builder?
What feature would I steal? A bit of a cop-out answer, I suppose, but I'd say the polish. I still think, like the layout builder, technically it works really well under the hood, and the way that it plugs into Drupal is really good, but it still feels a little clunky just using it. And so I think, right now we're still in the early stages, so we're still kind of depending on contrib modules, and there's new ones all the time, and it's a matter of picking which ones to use to make things feel a little bit better. So I think that just kind of that feel of I'm using a mature product is probably what I would take from the most, but I really actually like the automatic embeds too. So I just drop a link in there and just, now you've got a YouTube video. So, 2 answers. How about that? Yes?
Could you talk about responsive design and whether Drupal or WordPress is sufficiently easy for a non-developer to understand things like breakpoints and the fact that I chose 3 columns, but in a mobile it'll be 1. I see that as the place where the Squarespace shines because it just works.
Yeah, and I think Gutenberg kind of does it too, because it.
The question, I don't know.
Oh yes.
Sorry.
So the question was, in terms of responsive design, which one of these kind of works the best for a non-technical user in terms of helping them understand responsive design? And I think you're right that the Squarespaces of the world, they almost kind of take that issue away. They kind of hide it in the back where it's just you create whatever you want, whatever looks good, and then they'll handle how it's responsive. And with the immediate feedback of something like Squarespace, you can kind of click and drag your browser, and it'll shrink and just show you what it's going to look like on all those different sizes, and that's like what you see is literally what you get. Gutenberg kind of does the same thing where they're kind of hiding that from you. It's like, yeah, if you want 3 columns, that's great. You put them in there, we'll figure it out. Just drop the content in. And I think Layout Builders feels like it's going that way. So it's almost like the idea is you don't, as a content editor, really have to worry about that because we've got it. Like we'll just figure it out on the backside and it'll look good. And I think when you're designing the front of the site, you kind of have to keep that in mind as well as to how these content admin pieces are actually putting stuff together in the back end and how they're going to spit it out and how it's going to look good. So you're talking about like design systems and things, how you're going to integrate with that. So I'm not sure how you would integrate Gutenberg with a design system, but we have one at Pega and we're looking to Layout Builder, so hopefully it works. Because that's Kelly's job for the next however long. It's figuring out how that'll work. So yeah, so I think simplistically it should just work and you shouldn't have to think about that as a content editor. Is the gist of it. But we'll see how well it actually works.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anybody else? All right. Good. Thanks, guys.